Dr. Micah Schiller is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Aberdeen. Interestingly, her professional focus is on revealing the intricacies of the human brain and how it processes information received from our sense organs. This in turn helps us build a coherent perception of the world around us. So currently, she is trying to unravel how social information influences this process. Dr. Schiller completed a PhD from the University of Bath in 2019 under supervision of Dr. Karen Petrini and Dr. Michael Prue. She is credited with conducting intensive and extensive research on how the presence and absence of vision affect the perception developed in childhood. One of her outstanding achievements has been that she is a recipient of the Best Postgraduate Teacher of the Year award. Additionally, she also received the Associate Fellow of the Higher Education Academy Award while working as a teaching fellow at the University of Bath. Before that, she completed a Bachelor and Master of Science in Biology at the University of Belfield. She chose to work across different disciplines such as neurobiology, conservation ecology and evolution, biocybernetics, and cognitive neuroscience. This multifaceted experience has uniquely equipped her with more holistic approach to understand how the human mind and behavior works. I welcome you heartily, ma'am, to Psychology Simplified.
Thank you for having me here.
So let's start with the first question. Micah, in India, we still study humanities or science or commerce in watertight compartments to a great extent. But you have studied and researched various disciplines like neurobiology, conservation ecology and evolution, biocybernetics, and cognitive neuroscience, which I feel is amazingly diverse. Could you enlighten mainly the youngsters in my audience about the benefits of taking an interdisciplinary approach and how it has contributed to your career path?
Sure, that's a very good question. Thank you for that, Rajavi. So it does actually sound quite diverse, talking about conservation ecology, biocybernetics, neurobiology, but it's actually quite interesting because you can use these different disciplines to answer the same question. So for example, if you want to understand behavior, so why certain behavior is exhibited in specific contexts, you can use approaches from these different perspectives to basically look at and try to understand behavior. So I can give you an example of that. So we can try to approach this question: why is certain behavior exhibited in a specific situation from a mechanistic perspective or from a functional perspective? So in the mechanistic perspective, we basically ask, how is behavior generated or controlled? And there we would, for example, look at neurobiological, biocybernetic approaches. So a neurobiological approach would ask about the underlying mechanisms of behavior on the basis of single neurons or neuronal populations. The biocybernetics approach would take this knowledge from neurobiology and apply it in a often mathematically formalized way to better understand how different neurons or neuronal populations act together in systems to generate and control specific behavior. Then on the other side, we have the functional perspective, the why does behavior occur?
Yeah.
A different approach in ecology or evolution, for example. So an ecological approach will try to understand how behavior is modulated by the immediate and the extended environment of the individual. So in a way similar to biocybernetic, it takes a systems approach whereby we can try to understand how individuals interact within an ecosystem. This can range from understanding the influence of abiotic factors, so like climate, for example, those that shape habitable environments on a specific organism, or biotic factors that can be anything relating to the interaction of individuals, like feeding behavior, communication, mating, or even grieving behavior.
Yes.
And that also links strongly to the next point. If you zoom out a bit further, you basically look at an evolutionary approach. And that tries to explain how behavior evolved by the function in specific contexts. So we often find that behavior within individuals and within species is stable over time in situations. So we tend to exhibit the same behaviors across different situations and across time. And this is also when we would often speak of personality, for example, or in animals, we would also call that behavioral syndromes. And they're also partly heritable. So one way we would address that in like evolutionary research is we try to see it as evolutionary pressures, like selection, that typically operate at the phenotype. That is, in this case, like the expression of behavior, how they shape what specific behaviors in situations. So evolutionary theory would suggest that certain behaviors were favored during evolutionary development, because they allow the organism to adapt to the environment we live in. And I think this is something that is often quite underrepresented in psychological approaches, this kind of like ultimate approach of trying to answer why do we exhibit certain, how are they controlled? So overall, you can see that like behavior can be explained by mechanistic and functional perspectives, and also several other perspectives. And for me personally, like the sweet spot that connects psychology and biology the strongest, and probably also because it has the most to do with humans rather than non-human animals, is cognitive neuroscience. So in cognitive neuroscience, we're usually trying to understand how behavior is generated via the biological basis of the brain, of cognitive processes and mental processes, which are often quite difficult to quantify in purely physiological terms. So if you, for example, look at brain activation, the activation wouldn't necessarily tell you something about certain cognitive states unless you can also ask people specific questions about that. So just from looking at it, it's often quite hard to assess how certain cognitive processes are governed. So in these examples that I just gave you, they're largely just taking biology and psychology and partly mathematics into consideration. But at the same time, we wouldn't understand many aspects of mind and behavior without chemistry and physics, which lay the rules upon which core building blocks of life operate. So, and the same holds for philosophy and social sciences, which are also really important to help us understand human behavior, mainly in the social context.
And how it has evolved over the time.
Yeah, exactly, and how social interactions also shape the behavior that we exhibit repeatedly in specific situations. As humans, we're very social beings, so we're very strongly influenced by the social surroundings we are in, by the people we interact with. And there's like one example in that kind of connects physics to the whole thing, so that I'll come back to later. Probably that is psychophysics. So that's a methodological approach that we often use in cognitive neuroscience. So when you apply a psychophysical approach, you often tweak parameters in the physical environment that can be any like physical parameter like brightness or size, and assess how the change in this physical parameter relates to a change in the perception that it evokes in humans, in our brains, basically. So getting back to your question, I think overall the biggest advantages of studying and approaching a specific topic that you're interested in from different perspectives is that you gain a much deeper understanding of the topic you're interested in. You can test new ideas against criteria within these different fields. So for example, if you have a mechanistic explanation for behavior, does that also hold for like the ultimate, from the ultimate perspective, or does an ultimate explanation, is that supported by the mechanisms how a certain behavior is generated? So you can basically apply the different perspectives to the question that you're asking about the subject that you're interested in. Another advantage of that is you can, because you know how different fields like assess this specific, you can often find the best approaches to the question that you're trying to answer. So you have multiple tools available, and even if you're not expert in them yourself, you often can help communicating between experts in different fields, which is something that has become, I feel like, very rare. The ability to actually communicate with people in different disciplines, which often use like very different languages, is also probably one of the disadvantages of taking
I mean, like, there's a lot of jargon in everything that we study.
Absolutely, and people sometimes use it differently. So what some people term integration wouldn't be integration for others term a lot more narrowly. So it's sometimes quite hard to actually communicate between the different disciplines, but at the same time, if you've had an interdisciplinary upbringing, so if you studied something from several perspectives, it's a little bit easier for you to communicate between the different disciplines. And I think really the main advantage is that as long as you're approaching the kind of same topic from the different perspectives, it gives you a much more holistic understanding of that topic. So it's not just that you understand how behavior is controlled, but that you look at it like how it is controlled at different levels, so like at lower neural levels and at systems levels, how other processes like cognition, intentions, emotions affect that behavior, and then look at it in the like wider context of ecology and evolution. So I think it really allows you to look at something from multiple perspectives. It gives you a much richer picture in the end. And like any single discipline alone can probably not really tackle all the big questions. So it really requires knowledge and information to be integrated across different fields and disciplines. And as I said before, it really helps you to allow communication between different fields if you're a bit more familiar with what they're roughly doing. So, yeah.
That's great. I mean, I am impressed by the way you've tried to relate and establish a connection between all those different disciplines and how we behave as individuals. So, like, obviously, I have wondered about different things, but in psychology, perception relates to the sensory experience of the world, and we recognize the stimuli and act accordingly. And like I've moved on to the next question. So perception helps us imbibe information about the surroundings, which help us survive as individuals. So a very basic question that I could come up with was like, why do we perceive colors? And why do we experience certain illusions differently, like different from others? Like many of my friends have asked me to explain the common spinning dancer illusion or the moon illusion. So how does it all, like, could you please elaborate on that more?
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question as well. And that's something that I think is also quite popular question in terms of like how do we perceive? And I think one of the kind of main realizations that once you engage with that topic have is that perception is not a direct translation from the external environment to like what we see. So we don't necessarily see exactly what is there, but it's rather that our brain kind of like generates perception from the information that it gets from the different senses. So for example, if we look at an object, like if we look at this glass of water, the kind of the light that reflects from it is basically a pattern that is thrown onto my retina, which is the sensory surface with which I can sense light differences. And that pattern that is thrown onto my retina is then converted into electrical signals that are sent to my brain to be processed further. Yes. Now, the retina itself, but you also know we don't see the world in 2D, we see it in 3D, right? So one of the things that our brain does and that allows us to pretty immediately see something in 3D is kind of create this perception of depth. But it doesn't just do that randomly because it kind of knows how depth works, but it uses different cues that are in the signal that our eye sees, and recreates the third dimension from these cues. So, for example, there are different cues like shading of objects, the occlusion of objects. So if one object is behind another, it's likely further away. Binocular disparity, so which is basically the image of how an object image falls onto your retina. So it's slightly different for your left and for your right eye, and the difference of where it falls onto your retina, your brain can use to compute where it is in space, but also how far it is away. Yes. You also use like size, for example, like things that are further away are usually smaller, and that's quite interesting because if you think about someone who's never had vision, they might not actually have that feeling of things that are further away are smaller. This is a purely visual feature, but something that also helps us to determine whether something's further away or closer. So it's an and you learn through experience how big certain things are. So for example, if you see an elephant that is the size of a dog, it's likely that that elephant is further away. It's probably a really bad example, but it is one thing to think about it. Elevation, things that are further in your field of view are usually further away. Texture gradient, motion parallax. So there's a lot of different cues that your brain can use to compute depth from this 2 image that you get on your retina. And that also shows us a bit that like perception is not necessarily a one-to-one mapping that goes like from the outside like onto our eyes, and we already have all the information. We need to generate a lot. Now you mentioned that spinning dancer illusion, yes. Which I think you will show.
Yes, I will show it.
Okay. So you can, when you look at the spinning dancer illusion, you can actually see that a lot of the cues that our brains use to infer depth, like shading, occlusion, and all these things, are not present. So it's an ambiguous image. We also often speak of a bistable object, because you can see the dancer spinning either clockwise or anti-clockwise. So in bi-directionally, you can basically flip it in your head. And that's quite a beautiful example of showing some of the challenges that our brain is dealing with all the time when we perceive information from the environment. So because these depth cues aren't there, we basically can't really tell whether she's turning in clockwise or anti-clockwise.
Like, it's difficult to switch from clockwise to anti-clockwise and anti-clockwise to clockwise quickly, because once you put it in your head, it just moves that way. It does not change.
Absolutely. I find that it helps when you look away. So when you look away and then consciously try to rotate her the other way around, that sometimes works. And then it's really hard to rotate her back. Some people have the tendency to always see her spinning, I think, counterclockwise. So there's a larger proportion of people perceiving her to spin that way. But even the fact that people disagree so much on which direction she's turning shows us that there's something more going on than just a direct translation from what you see on the screen to what you actually create in your head. So yeah. Certain cues aren't there, and when certain information isn't there, we often consciously actually perceive that something is an illusion, or kind of the perception of a unified perception kind of breaks down. So we have different types who perceive certain things in different ways. And consciously, that doesn't necessarily happen in most cases in everyday life. And this is because we often have a lot of cues available in the environment that can be within a sense. So for example, these cues that I mentioned for depth perception in vision, but we also have other senses that help us to put together different cues into an image of the environment. So in this depth example, you can also use audition, for example, where when things are further away, they're usually quieter, when they're closer, they're louder. So a lot of different cues that we can use. When these illusions usually become more obvious to us when there's little information available. So there's one example that I really like. It's a multi-sensory illusion, which is when you sit on the train, for example. That pulled into it, and your train is standing like next to another train, both stationary. You're looking out of the window to the other train. Now, one of the trains starts moving, and you can't tell whether it's your train or the other train. This is like, I get that all the time. I'm not sure if you also get that. It's really confusing. And that's because the image, like if your train was moving or the other train, the image would be the same for you. So you can't really disambiguate. It's an ambiguous situation again.
For a few seconds, you sure get confused, but obviously, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what usually helps in these moments is looking out of the other window, because we have this like internal prior, so we have this internal expectation about the world to be stable. if everything around us moves at the same time, we infer this as self-motion, because it's more likely that things on the retina move all at the same time when we are moving, rather than everything around us moving. So this often helps disambiguate such a situation. When you look out of the other window and see the train station being stable, then you know it's likely your train that is moving forward. You can also use a different sense, your vestibular system, which usually tells you something about movement and acceleration, but our vestibular system is quite noisy in that it doesn't give us like super precise information, and usually vision overrides, or vision is a lot more reliable when you assess motion in any direction compared to your vestibular system.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that was amazing, honestly, because it's so important to like consider the different kinds of illusions we see in our everyday life. And you cleared a lot of doubts that and gave us new perspectives to think on illusions and sensations and different sensations working together at the same time. So that was quite informative. That was very informative. And okay, let's move on to the next question. I read somewhere that people with blindness since birth are able to perceive touch faster than those who can see. And how does loss of sense in terms of vision lead to enhanced tactile perception? Could you please explain in very simple words for the audience?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. And I think the first thing we need to make clear here is that we have to differentiate again between sensation, so changes at the sensor level, or perception, so whether perception improves or whether something improves at the sensor level, because the sensory surfaces usually don't change with it. But what changes is how sensory information is represented in the brain. So the perception part is what changes usually, rather than the sensory part. So there is a lot of evidence showing that blind people have superior sensory abilities in the other senses.
Yeah.
So if you look at that from like a mechanistic perspective, we can see that the brain, or the parts of the brain that usually process visual information, process touch and hearing information in the blind. So the visual cortex at the back of the head has been shown to be involved in processing the kind of like blind language for the blind. That is like not embossed, it's embossed, tactile language.
It's a braille, majorly.
Exactly. So braille reading, auditory space perception, so any form of space perception,
Yes.
largely, is taking part in kind of the visual cortex of blind people. And that is showing us something that we already know, but it's showing it in a very compelling way, which is that the brain is flexible. So we say the brain is plastic. And it's plastic enough to rewire itself, and how it is processing sensory information depend the experience an individual makes. So this is something quite crazy when you actually think about it, that our brain is able to learn senses while we develop. So that also means that our brain will be able to learn new senses when we develop, right? However, this plasticity is not indefinite. So that means that the general architecture of how the brain is organized is likely genetically determined. So it's shaped by evolution, while the specifics on how a brain is processing information can be shaped through individual experience. So that also explains why all of us differ slightly in the way we perceive things. So why we differ in the way we perceive certain colors, why we differ in the propensity of perceiving the spinning dancer illusion in one way or the other. So all of that can happen, or the experiences we make can have an influence of how our brain creates this perception from the information it gets. You specifically mentioned blindness since birth, and I think this is a very important point also to mention here, and this is because the flexibility or the plasticity of the brain differs throughout development. So it's usually highest in childhood and gets gradually less. So within the first years of life, early sensory experience has a much stronger impact now or later. they still develop until adolescence, and there's also evidence that they're still quite flexible to change in adults, but the extent to which the brain can rewire and change is largest in childhood. So any adaptations, for example, any changes in the perceptual system to the current sensory input that children get are strongest early in life.
Yeah.
Kind of from a functional perspective, that plasticity makes sense, right? Because the brain of a newborn does not know which environment it's born into. So it makes little sense for our genes to determine how exactly the brain needs to represent information. It's much more important for the brain to learn how to represent it, depending on the environment that it is born into. And as environments change over time, our ability to perceive specific information that is more common in the environment needs to change too. So you can imagine, for example, that a blind person who might not be able to see, but who's well able to perceive the information in the environment through the remaining senses, for them it's important that the brain represents the other senses, such as touch and hearing, much more accurately and precisely than vision.
So, definitely that answer was so informative, and I'm sure none of those watching the interview of yours must have known about this before, like especially the difference and the explanation about sensation and perception. So, moving on to the next question. In a research of yours, the findings indicate that in children, haptics play a significant role as compared to adults who use multisensory inputs to their benefit. So could I request you to explain to my viewers how you were able to reach this conclusion in simple words, and how does this information how is this information useful for parents or caregivers and students, teachers? So how is it?
That's a good question, and I'm not quite sure if I can answer the second part of it, but I'll give it a try. So a way in which you can find that like children don't use multisensory information extend as adults is when you give them a very simple task. For example, you want them to tell the difference between two objects and how big they are. So you want them to make a size discrimination. Is one object bigger than the other? Now that you have to do that in two senses at the same time. If you're interested in like multisensory perception, so for example, you can ask children to touch an object and to look at it. You can do that once at a time. So you once ask them to only touch it, and at another time you ask them to only look at it, and then you ask them to do both. In both cases, in all three cases, you can basically estimate how precise children are when they're using one sense, the other sense, or both senses in combination. Yeah. And something that has been found before is that children usually don't make use of having two senses at the same time to the same extent that adults do. So adults usually combine the information from both senses in a way that reflects the reliability of each sense. So if one sense, for example, vision, is better at this task, they weight the information from vision more than the information from touch, and then they combine it. So that would lead to a much better percept than if they would use only vision alone. Now, children don't usually do that. Children tend to exhibit sensory dominance. So for them, like one sense is more important than another sense. And dominates that percept independently of whether it's more reliable or not. So even if touch, for example, is not as reliable as vision, they tend to focus mainly on touch rather than vision. And that dominance is very task specific. So if you give children this task that I just described to you of size discrimination, then touch would be weighted much stronger, so would be much more important for the child than vision. If you give them a different task, you want them to discriminate between different orientations. In this case, vision is a lot more dominant than touch, so they would kind of ignore the touch information again they get and only look at the object. So in a way, this sensory dominance is not only it does not only affect touch, it does also affect touch for specific tasks where touch is more robust. So where it gives you the more direct information about that property that you're trying to assess. But it changes depending on the task, which sense is more dominant. And it has been suggested that that is due to the fact that children are still developing, their bodies are growing, their limbs are getting longer. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to already use the information in a combined way, but rather to let the sense that gives you the more direct and more that property teach the other senses. That has been called cross-modal calibration, which is quite a mouthful. It basically just means one sense that is more robust teaches the other senses about specific properties in the environment. And that knowledge that our brain builds up about how certain things are working in the environment, how the statistics on the environment, how frequently they occur, for example, how big they usually are, all of that knowledge our brain can use to make predictions about what we're perceiving. And these predictions also help in generating perception in a kind of coherent way. Yes. So how is that useful for parents and caregivers? I think the useful bit to take away from this is that, and I think this is not new to most parents and to most teachers, is the fact that we should ideally give children a multisensory experience of the world. That means it's best if we represent information in as many different senses as we can, because this is how our brain learns best. If the brain gets the confirmation about a specific information from two senses, it can learn a lot better and a lot quicker about how that property is distributed in the environment, so how this property exists in the environment. And it also uses that knowledge to train the different senses. So it's in I feel for people that work with children with sensory impairments, for example, depending on the sensory impairment that the child has, maybe like hearing impaired or vision impaired, the training is often very much focused on the remaining senses, but only on single senses, rather than trying to provide like a multisensory experience, seeing what other senses can be used to help that child learn about an information that it can't access.
Yes, like physical touch can be a very important aspect for a visually impaired child, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And physical touch is very important for all of us at the same time. I think this is something that we often tend to forget. So when if I would ask, which sense you would be most content with giving away, so which one would you be the least sad about if you wouldn't have it? What would you answer?
No, maybe it could be like, I don't know, vision. Because like
vision, because we're very visually dominant.
Yes, I mean, most of things are visually dominant because we see the colors and we see the shapes and we understand through that, but we can also feel like the shape and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, vision is super important for us. And we also, we build the world around us, like all the artificial world we build is very vision focused. It's really hard for blind people to find their way around without further aids. But at the same time, something that we often really neglect is our sense of touch. So how would you actually feel? How would you
we can't
if you wouldn't feel touch?
Yeah.
We can't, right? Because touch and the feeling of our body and our body in relation to the world outside gives us this sense of self as well. It gives us this idea of like being a kind of entity environment. So if we wouldn't have that, that would be a very strange thing to get used to, I guess.
Like you just don't know, like what if someone gets hurt and they start bleeding, but they don't know why they're bleeding? So that can really confuse a person.
exactly, pain. Like if we wouldn't feel pain, that would be very dangerous for us.
Yeah.
Like for some people with chronic pain, it might be a relief, but for other people with where you experience acute pain, that's usually a warning signal. It's something you should respond to. So it's definitely something that is, from an ultimate perspective, very important that it has evolved to help us protect ourselves.
Definitely. I totally agree with you. And I'm very sure the parents and the caregivers of the kids would now have a clearer idea about why kids, like, they want to be touched lovingly too. And it's mostly like we touch the objects, but obviously, like, physical touch is really important, especially in these times when we aren't able to meet other people and, COVID generally. So, yeah, I mean, I do hug my parents sometimes, and I need the oxytocin. So, yes, I mean, since most of the kids are still learning through touch and the other senses, they tend to understand more through touch, I feel. Because, as you said, it is one of the most important senses that we have. So, yes.
It also develops the earliest. It's one of the what's the first sense that is like almost fully developed. I mean, fully developed is always hard to assess, but it is very like strongly developed when children are born. So the sense of smell and the sense of touch is usually already pretty good at that age, because this is the main at that age, like as newborns, because this is the main like the senses that tell them about the environment directly. So it is something that is quite important. As you said, like effective touch especially is something that as social creatures that we are is really, really important to us, and also really doesn't only affect how we emotionally develop, but also how perception develops. So there's at least some evidence now suggesting that perception is influenced by effective touch in childhood. So yeah.
And I must say, it's been very kind of you to spare your precious time from your very busy schedule with multiple roles and responsibilities to shoulder in the new semester at your university. And at this point, I'm reminded of the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, as both the water bodies receive water from River Jordan, while Dead Sea is lifeless because it has only the water flowing in and not flowing out of it. On the other hand, Sea of Galilee is resplendent with flora and fauna. You might wonder why, because it's like the latter has inflow and outflow, and we should receive and give too. So today, Micah has been like the Sea of Galilee for all of us, sharing her in-depth knowledge and experience selflessly. I can only hope that she too flourishes, not just in the present, but in the future as well. Thank you so much for being with us.